started?
Yeah, why not?
Great. Well, I want to introduce Mary. I should call her Dr. Mary Deniko. She is a person that I've worked with over the years and we've collaborated. I'm going to introduce her formally in a bit after I share like 2 to 3 minutes of a short presentation. But I do want to acknowledge, what happened earlier over the weekend with Dante Wright. And I know that, unfortunately, we have to keep having these conversations of these distressing events and whether it's stop Asian hate crimes or police brutality. It is unfortunate that this is ongoing, but we are super grateful that we get a platform to discuss these issues and just generate awareness even within our own community within INNOCEAN. I think it helps. It's a little bit cathartic, but also more importantly helps empower us just being aware of these issues. But before we jump into this conversation with Mary, I do want to go through just quickly what's been going on, because the topic at hand really is the rise of anti-Asian violence. And give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay. And let me present. Okay. So I'm sure everybody has been seeing stuff on social, but just to level set and sort of humanize the issue, I want to just provide some statistics and sort of who are the victims of these crimes. So since the pandemic, anti-Asian hate crimes have surged 150%. Right now, there's a tally of 3,800 attacks. And, you have to note that this is those that are reported. I mean, this is just tip of the iceberg. I mean, so many people, there's a question of whether or not it is a hate crime, whether or not it was racially motivated, and a lot of people just kind of shrug it off. But, it is sort of climbing at an alarming rate. And I think there's this perception that it's happening somewhere else, somewhere in Oklahoma, somewhere in the flyover states, but it's actually happening in quote unquote liberal cities. It's happening in Oakland, LA, New York. It's definitely in our own backyard. In Orange County, it's up by 1,200%. In New York City, it's 1,900%, and in LA, it's 115%. And among those that have been reported, 70% of the attacks were made against Asian women. 13% are against Asian youth, and 6.2% against seniors. And we have to ask ourselves, why are these particular groups being attacked? And I think we're going to dig in a little bit on that topic. I do want to share this clip.
What a terrible thing.
But
you don't hear them talking about COVID. To be specific, COVID-19. That name gets further and further away from China, as opposed to calling it the Chinese virus. By the way, it's a disease, without question, has more names than any disease in history. I can name Kung Flu. I can name 19 different versions of names. What a terrible.
Oops. So obviously there's some, I guess people feel at liberty to, kind of scapegoat Asians. And, we've been seeing a lot of these attacks filmed. And I do want to kind of, handpick a few just to humanize again what's been happening. This is Vicha Ratanapakdi. He's an 84-year-old Thai immigrant from San Francisco, and he died a month after being violently shoved to the ground during his morning walk. This 89-year-old woman was slapped and set on fire by 2 people in Brooklyn, New York. Vilma Kari, this happened just recently. She was on her way to church and she was kicked and stomped on in Manhattan in broad daylight. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this video, but I don't know, this was very disturbing to me, that the the 3 hotel security guards that were standing really, close by could have helped. They just stood by watching, and one onlooker just closed the door, leaving her on the sidewalk. And on March 16th, a shooter went to 3 Asian spas around the Atlanta-ish area and killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. The county police dismissed the possibility that it was racially motivated because the shooter said he was purging himself of his sexual addiction and he was having a bad day. So I wanted to give, one line each of the victims. Hyung Jung Grant, she was 51. She was a single loving mom who lived for her sons. Zhao Jia Tan, 49, who's dreamed of celebrating her 50th, traveling the world with her daughter. Delana Yuan, 33, who left behind her 13-year-old son and 8-month daughter. Paul Andre Michaels, 54, veteran and family man. Yang Yu, 63, a hardworking woman who loved to sing karaoke and Sunday dinners. Soonja Kim, 69, all she wanted to do was to grow old with her husband and watch her children and grandchildren live the life she never got to live. Soon Chung Park, 74, lover of line dancing. Everybody thought she was going to live past 100. And Dao Yu Feng, she was 44, quiet, kind, and hardworking. I just wanted to share that with you, not to, be depressing, but it is really important to know that these are, grandmothers and mothers who are being attacked and what's really going on. But before we launch into that, I do want to introduce Dr. Danico. She, again, is a friend of mine. She's a professor of sociology at Cal Poly Pomona. She's also the endowed chair of the Michi and Walter Weglian Multicultural Studies Center. And she's also the director of Asian American Transnational Research Initiative at Cal Poly. She's done everything under the sun. And, honestly, she gives her all, not just to her students, but, spreading awareness throughout the community. And I just thank you so much for your time. But I do want to talk about anti-Asian hate, but let's talk about you a little bit and kind of go through sort of your experiences and what influenced you to choose the career that you did.
Thank you so much, Linda. And again, thank you all for inviting me to your virtual home, to your company. It's wonderful to be here. I wanted to just first start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm currently residing in the land of Native Hawaiians in the island of Oahu in the Mo'ili'i area. And I want to give thanks to the Indigenous community here for allowing me to be here. How did I get into this profession? Who knows, right? I think there is no clear trajectory in my life that said, okay, this is where you're going to end up. There are a lot of accidental shifts and turns. But I think what I can say is that I have always been rooted in justice work, in social justice work. I immigrated to the United States when I was 7 years old. And early on, not speaking a lick of English, I did not understand why people didn't like me, a 7-year-old kid, where people would say mean things to me. I can tell, not because I understood what they said, but from their mannerism, their behaviors, their body language. And I wonder, why did these adults, mostly white adults, why did they hate me? I couldn't understand it. And I hated coming to the United States. I wanted to go back home. I begged my dad. Later on, I found out from my father, the reason why he brought us to the US is because in Korea, the misogyny and the patriarchy is so blatant. He felt much worse in the US, that having 3 daughters growing up in Korea would have been very difficult for us. And he thought the US was the land of opportunities, that it would be a place that we would have a chance. And so that's why we came. So for the first years of my life, I grew up in San Francisco. I was what I often tell, and Catherine may remember this, I don't know if I share this in class, but I was what many people would say was a chola in training. I grew up in predominantly with Latino and African-American kids. My best friends were Black and Latino. And my identity kind of evolved in terms of in that community. And I built a lot of alliances and friendships with communities of color. And so when we moved, because my sisters got into gangs and a lot of trouble, my dad moved us to a very affluent suburban area in Hillsborough, California, I learned how to talk to white people for the very first time. And I know it may sound kind of odd, right, in many ways, but it was wonderful because I realized that despite all of our differences, that there were some shared commonalities that we all faced. But I always took remark to oppression and discrimination that I saw inflicted among other people, including myself. I try not to dwell on so much myself, but I try to focus on the homophobia that I saw in San Francisco. I looked at the oppression against disabled communities, or people who are homeless, or people who fell into hard times and became addicts in the streets. And I was sharing with Linda earlier that I learned that just because people made bad decisions did not make them bad people. And I began to question what was the social, political, economic factors in their lives that ended the way they did. I have 3 siblings and all of us turned out very, very different. So sometimes it's not just the family upbringing, right? It's the environment that we live in, the mentorship that we have, the support that we have from families and friends. And we all had different experiences in that way. So I ended up going to Davis, going into sociology. I didn't really understand, honestly, even in San Francisco, what it meant to be Asian American until I moved to Hawaii. And I went and pursued my PhD at University of Hawaii. And this was the very first place where I felt comfortable in my skin. And I changed my research topic completely from interracial dating, and I was in domestic violence, well, not in domestic, I was doing research on domestic violence and studying youth crimes and so forth, to looking at ethnic identity among Korean Americans, the impact of community and family. I think my root of my childhood has framed what I do today, because my parents both really pushed us. They were, I think they didn't realize this, but they're feminist, and they really encouraged us to stand our ground, to speak up, to make waves, to not be bullied. And I really thank my mom for that. She's deceased 10 years now, but I really thank for her role modeling in shaping what I do. So today, I was the past president of the Association for Asian American Study, a national organization. And I realized that we can't just talk and research it, but we actually have to practice it and do it on a daily basis. And it's pretty exhausting, as you know, Linda. I mean, doing scholarly activism is hard, and I have a lot of fatigue, but it's also quite rewarding because I do see shifts. I do see fissures that are beginning to open up. And I do see, you know, not just students, but community folks when their eyes widen up. I love working with my community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, but I also love working with allies. And I find such strengths when I see folks like you, all who are here present and engaged and really willing to listen and to take stock of reflecting on our own positionalities. I think that's what keeps me going, is to know that, hey, things will get better. I am still very hopeful despite the rise in anti-Asian hate. I am still very hopeful that we can make things better.
Yeah, and I mean, you know this, Mary, before my foray into advertising, I definitely was planning on becoming an Asian, you know, a historian focused on Asian American history. So, and a lot of it was fueled on just learning about my own identity. It was definitely a void that I felt. But thinking about what I learned in school about what was going on, and then what's happening today, I want to ask you how the surge in attacks against Asian, how is it different from the past?
Yeah, I mean, you know, for those of us who study this, it's nothing new. So it's not something that it just all of a sudden happened. It's been happening since the time that we were brought over as indentured servants in terms of lynching and killing of Asian American lives. I think what's different is social media. And I think what's also different is the political and cultural climate, where there are so many people who feel, and sadly, it's not just white Americans. I think there are also people who have internalized racism, who have problems with, who've been colonized in a way that they don't really like themselves either, that they feel that their liberties and access to freedom or wealth or economy has been stripped away. So if you think about the most recent, well, in my age bracket, some of the more recent timeframes of like the Vincent Chen murder, where Vincent Chen was a Chinese American in Detroit, where he was at a bachelor party, for those who may not know. And there's a great documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chen by Renee Tajima Pena. It was Oscar nominated. And he was beaten to death by two white men who were laid off from work, who blamed him, mistook him for being Japanese, and blamed him for the downfall of the economy of the auto industry. And Helen Zia, who was featured in that documentary, is an incredible, she's my role model, she's my shiro, where she became a spokesperson, and it really galvanized Asian American communities to find justice for Vincent, for this young man who was about to get married, who was killed at his prime, just because of the way he looked, right? When you begin to think about that. But hate crimes against Asian Americans also happened during the railroads, during the orchard pickings in Orange County. You know, a lot of times folks feel like this is a new thing. I think what's different though, is when we began to see a shift in, or maybe a silence of those who are overtly racist because of the way the politics have been shaping our country, pro-civil rights, you know, in terms of justice for equality for all ethnic groups. And I do have to say this, Linda, that a lot of the advantages that Asian Americans have experienced have been because of Black lives. The Black civil rights really helped us as a community, not just Asian Americans, but Latino communities, Indigenous communities as well, in elevating anti-oppression work. And there's been a lot of work between Black and Asian lives as well. But I think what's really different is Trump. I mean, if I'm going to say it really bluntly, is that we knew that during Obama era that the quote unquote post-racial America was a fallacy. It just didn't exist. We did not live in a post-racial America when Obama was elected. I think people got very comfortable that they thought that we were in a good space racially. Conversely, there's another group of folks who were just pissed off that we had a Black man in the White House. And we began to see a swell of anti-Black, Indigenous, people of color movement. And this anger and that fueled, that you're taking away what's rightfully mine. I want it back. And so when Trump was, running for president the first time and said, "Make America great again," it really spoke to people. He's not the first to say it. Ronald Reagan said it too. But the difference with Trump is that he fueled it with a lot of racist and ableist, misogynistic, sexist comments that targeted his supporters who felt that, yeah, I was wrong. So I think the political climate shift, and then social media too, because once things go viral, such as his Twitter accounts, which should have been, in my opinion, disabled a long time ago, really gave ammunition for folks to say my feelings are valid. Me feeling like a victim, I'm talking about white supremacist folks or misogynistic people who feel like they've been victimized. They felt that they had ammunition and even support from the highest office in this land to actually do something about it. And actually, he actually encouraged people to go beat them up, go take them. He encouraged violence. So folks felt righteous that, hey, our president is telling us to do this. Mm-hmm. I think that has been the biggest change, sociologically speaking, if you're thinking at from a macro lens as well as at a micro lens, that gave people permission to do wrong openly. Mm-hmm. and feel that they'll be pardoned, right. They felt that they'll be forgiven.
Yeah, no, I mean, every time he said Kung flu and Chinese virus, I mean, there was absolutely no accountability. I mean, it's the equivalent, you know what I mean? It's like, you just don't know, you couldn't imagine that lack of accountability, but it was happening. And I mean, and we're seeing in social media all the, attacks, but it has been happening. There has been a huge uptick since the pandemic, but I remember in March of last year, so many of my friends were getting attacked, like getting kicked out of stores for no reason because of this fear that we were bringing the virus, and it didn't matter if we it didn't matter what kind of Asian you were, basically.
Right.
But, you know, I do want to talk about who is being attacked. I mean, we talked about women and children and the elderly. Can you talk a little bit more about why are they the victims, and what are the sort of stereotypes and sort of misperceptions that are fueling that?
Mhm. Well, I think like anecdotally, a lot of folks have been talking about, you know, stereotypes about Asian American women or, you know, youth and elderly and so forth that leads to it, such as the model minority, which is part of it. I think the model minority stereotype definitely fuels hate among communities. It's actually pitted more for communities of color against each other. So if you look at the New York attack on the Filipino woman, 65 years old, who had the bystanders who didn't do anything, her attacker was a person of color. And so a lot of times, you know, it's not necessarily about white against, you know, communities of colors, but it's the internalizing of these sentiments that you're talking about, Linda, that, you know, that blaming certain communities for taking things away or giving, such as COVID, to communities, buying into a lot of these lies. And I think when you begin to think about why is it that, you know, is it just the stereotypes? Is it just that the anger and the fuel? It's about feeling a loss of power. And I want to share with you a quote by Audre Lorde, which I found that I think is really quite telling in terms of why people begin to attack each other. In her book, Sister Outsider, she highlights, and I quote, "the false notion that there is only a limited and particularly amount of freedom that must be divided up between us. So instead of joining together, fight for more, we quarrel between ourselves for a larger slice of one pie." And I think this is in terms of how a lot of communities of color also are pitted, but also with white Americans too, right? In terms of when you see majority of the hate that have been sent to Asian Americans from spitting on and the everyday or racial slurs that we hear to the really violent acts that we've been seeing, you know, publicized very widely, stems from fear. People are afraid of losing what they think that is owed to them or what they feel like they should have.
Mhm.
And they blame other communities of color for taking away what is theirs. And unfortunately, the model minority stereotypes positions Asian Americans as the one with the greatest economic threat to those who currently have it, because we're perceived as being successful. We're perceived as being the model of all the you know, persons of color, where we can challenge economic wealth because we are doing well in school, we're doing well in businesses and so forth. And for those of you, I'm sure many of you already know, it's a myth, right? We have, if you disaggregate the data for Asian American and Pacific Islanders, we are not all educated, we're all not wealthy, and we're all not doing well. And in fact, I think 5 years ago, I haven't looked at the most recent data, but 5 years ago, Asian American young women were the most, had the highest incidence of attempted suicide because of mental health strain. And when you think about why is it that we pick on the most vulnerable, older Asian grandmas and aunties and mothers, it's about power. Obviously, these folks don't have an economic threat to the people who are attacking them. In fact, they pose no threat to them. But it's a way of, if you look, if I study domestic violence as well and crime, if you look at any type of perpetrators, it's about inflicting pain and fear into someone else to show that their power. And it's really about power dynamics. And the capitalist mode of our country fuels these insecurities among folks that we have to blame someone. So let's blame the ones that seems to be doing better than me. I think in terms of the women, with the Atlanta shooting, what was so disturbing is that people automatically assume that these women who were murdered, 6 of the 8 of Asian descent, were sex workers, just because the person said, I had a bad day and I need to deal with my sex addiction. So automatically they thought these older aunties were sex workers. And this speaks to a broken narrative in our country where we see Asian American women either as submissive, docile, quiet, complacent, don't make waves women, or dragon lady who are sexually available, sexually promiscuous, and there to please you. And that has a lot to do with the military complex and the colonization that fueled the narratives of some men who buy into the notion that, oh, these women are available for us at our taking, and we dehumanize these women, you know. And so the problem of attacking certain communities, I would argue, has more to do with power and fear than to do with anything else. But you know, it's complex, right? It's quite nuanced.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Atlanta shooting kind of it basically revealed different stereotypes and different tensions that really came to the surface, and the fact that the police actually listened to him and said, oh, he was having a bad day and he wanted to purge himself. I mean, that's just, I mean, it was an intersection of the things that really plague the community in terms of women being hypersexualized and being, you know, an easy victim.
Yeah, it's just disgusting, actually. I mean, when you just, it's like the Kung Flu, or him saying, people laughed at that. There were people who actually laughed at Kung Flu. People laughed at him saying it was a sex addiction. And then they began to put the blame on some of the women, right? There's some folks, if you look at the conservative Twitter or the chat features, they began to blame these women for being sex workers when none of them were, right? And so it's blaming the victim as opposed to assuming, like, why is it that these people are fueling hate and violence against communities of color, and in this scenario, Asian Americans? And I think that's the thing. We need to say the words of what it is, and to not assign this as a hate crime is complicity. Like, they're complicit in the violence. If folks are saying that, well, you know, he's just having a bad day, or, well, does it really happen? Or is it really that bad? We have to call it for what it is. And I think that's what we have a responsibility to begin to name it and to say it out loud and to not excuse it. Because when we do, then we become co-conspirators in those kinds of crimes and those kinds of narratives.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the model minority myth, I mean, I have family members who subscribe to it as well. You know, who, well, you know, it's actually a very beneficial stereotype. You know, people aren't afraid of me, and you know, for the most part, I mean, even with all these attacks, they're not afraid of going out because they're the model minority, right? And they get to fly under the radar. And you know, going back to the idea of how this really pits us against other communities of color. And it also, these attacks just show that, you know, when push comes to shove, we are not the model minority. We are not the ones that, you know, there's this idea of Asians being the perpetual foreigner. It doesn't matter. My husband is 4th generation Japanese. It doesn't matter. You know, there's still surprise and shock when his family, who's been here forever, can speak perfect English. So, I mean, all these are coming to a head right now. They've been, and it's just been amplified through social media, for better or for worse. But I do want to talk a little bit about the less egregious forms of anti-Asian discrimination. What are the sort of, what are the everyday things that Asians face in the workplace or, you know, in their communities?
Right. I think the microaggression that Asian Americans face on the daily varies, right, depending on the communities that they live in. And it's from very subtle to sometimes really offensive. So the subtle ones are, wow, your English is so good. Where did you learn how to speak English? That's subtle. Or where are you from? Where are you really from? Those are a very subtle microaggression that tells you that you don't belong here. You're not really from here. You're not really one of us. And so the notion of the honorary white or perpetual forever foreigner is a great book by Mia Tuan with that title, you know, that talks about the dichotomy of the way that we are seen in terms of whether we're foreigners forever or that, you know, we're the model minority. I think some of the microaggression too is people think we're the end of the jokes, right? We're the butt of the jokes, from our accents for some of our family members who have accents, to making, you know, slant eye features, or making jokes like, oh, you know, how do you blindfold an Asian American? There's all these very like things that people lack. We're the butt of the jokes, and we're made fun of because of our physical features. So that's one. The way we speak, that's another. It's so much not today, but before even our foods were something to be critiqued, that we eat weird, bizarre foods. I don't know if you remember Joe Rogan's Fear Factor, but they used to have everyday Asian foods in Fear Factors. Like they had like raw squid, that is a Korean delicacy that you put in gochujang, right? They had it and people were eating like, oh, I'm eating raw squid, it's so gross. You know, and I'd be like, all the Asian people on Fear Factor will be eating it up, you know, like give me that. Or, you know, even like the balut. But they foreignize our food, they foreignize our language, they foreignize our culture, they foreignize our families. Like even the notion of being in an extended home where you live with an extended family is seen as odd in the American lens, as if it's a horrible thing to welcome your family into your home. It's seen as a negative thing. So I think a lot of those are the microaggressions that people felt. And so for a lot of young kids, if you think about the youth that are being attacked today, and when schools begin to open, Stop API Hate just put out a report about, please be mindful when the children start to go back to school. We are going to see a rise in anti-Asian hate against young people. So, and I think also we have Asian Americans are the ones who are less willing to go back to school right now. Young kids and the families don't want to send their kids to school because they're fearful of this, of the everyday microaggression and the bullying that children experience. And I experienced this myself, so I can tell you, it could turn you in a particular way, right? I mean, one way or the other, either you withdraw or you fight, one or the other. And so it can be quite damaging, and it's going to be instrumental how we respond for young people right now. It's all, I don't know if any of you are parents in here, or if you're aunties or older siblings, please be very mindful as the young people start to go, because they may not tell you that they're being bullied at school. They may not tell you about the everyday microaggression. Then some of the folks, depending on some parts of the world, and it's more urban areas, more city areas that people are facing some of the most vicious kinds of hate crimes, not in the rural areas. Places like Georgia and Atlanta, you don't see incidents of anti-Asian hate in the same way. So people have a very skewed understanding about what kind of people will, you know, exude hate toward communities like us. And so I think when you begin to think about the more spitting on people, which we've had in Los Angeles quite a bit, to graffiti work or damaging property, those are other forms of microaggression that happens on a daily for some communities living in certain areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and the idea of being the butt of jokes and easy targets definitely resonates. And I think for me, myself, I think I have to battle that myself, you know, think about what my rebuttal will be and how to stand up, because there is a lot of that internalized, I mean, it is cultural too, in terms of just like keeping your head down, but also it is internalized. We just, you know, you have to fight through that, that urge. I want to go back to a topic that we had discussed in terms of communities of color kind of being pit against each other. And when Vicha Rata, oh gosh, I can't say his last name, sorry. But when he died, Daniel Day Kim of Hawaii Five-0, he and Daniel Wu had asked, they offered $25,000 for anyone who can give up more information for another attack in San Francisco. And that sort of alarmed a lot of people because it was encouraging vigilantism and over policing in Black communities because it was happening in Oakland. And so I want to talk a little bit about Black and Asian relations, sort of the tensions that we saw in the LA riots and we continue to see today. Can you talk about, you know, is this just a narrative that's being overblown? How do we fight these tensions and how do we get past it?
Yeah, I think there are definitely some tensions in communities, right? I mean, that is a reality. But again, not to repeat myself, but it stems from historical legacy of pitting communities of colors against each other. And I think one of the things that in our history books or everyday understanding, people do not know that there has been a long history of Asian Black coalition building. It is not a new thing right now because of the anti-Asian hate and the Black Lives Matter. We have been seeing this as far as from Frederick Douglass from the 1700s, being anti-colonization in countries of Asia, to Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X coalition with the Black Panthers, to Grace Lee Boggs and her communities with the Black community. And we just have, and even in terms of Latino and Asian communities, we've had, people think of Cesar Chavez as the one who really helped with the economic factors, but actually Larry Itlong in the same Delano area was pivotal in creating that force of that unionizing the labor movement in the Central Coast. So I think there's a lot that people don't realize that has happened, that continues to happen. Richard Aoki is another who worked with the Black Panthers. So there's a lot of Asian American Black coalition that has a long stem history of fighting together. Third World Liberation Front in the end of the 60s that sparked the ethnic studies movement definitely was part of a lot of coalition building with Latinos, Blacks, and Indigenous and Asian Americans. But we don't teach these things in schools. I mean, we don't talk about this. So I'm sure many of you may not even know about it because it's not told. We don't talk about how Black military people have actually stood up for Asian countries. And this is important because even though it's about Asian Americans, is that there is a long understanding of oppression and how colonization really does kill lives, kills countries, kills people in them. And that Black military people have always been one of the forefront of supporting Asian country people. And people forget that in Asia as well. Mm-hmm. In Japan, there is a Black samurai. There's actually a movie that's going to come out about the first Black samurai, right? And in terms of a lot of different coalition building. But I think, the whole notion of policing too, there's so many lies that are told about policing, because what it does is policing ultimately hurts Black lives, because the police began, as many of you may or may not know, began during the slave period as a way to bring back slaves, right, with those who escaped. And the police as an institution has a long history of correlation with white supremacist groups like the KKK. And when communities call out, they think that it's going to benefit Asian American communities if there's more policing. But what it actually does is it pits more Black Asian conflict. It creates more Black Asian conflict. And there are much more progressive Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are saying that the call for more policing dismisses the coalition buildings and reduces the efforts that we have to kind of work together. Like Audre Lorde was saying, it's like, hey, instead of trying to fight for a piece of the pie, let's make pie together, right? Let's have more pie so we can all have more as opposed to have less. And I think the policing catalyzes like racial tension, and it feeds off it, the system, this oppressive system that we have built as a nation, very sadly, feeds off that, and it feeds off our own insecurities and fears. And so I think there is a more of a consciousness awareness. Like what you're doing today, Linda, is awesome, because there are over 100 people here listening to us, and hopefully they'll share some of these stories and it'll just kind of keep spreading. As people begin to understand that policing is not the issue, we need to take into consider more about well-being, about mental health, about support for communities. Over-policing leads to more prisons, and we have more funding going into the prison state than we do in education. And you have to kind of ask yourself, what is the value of the United States, where we want to create a police and military state here and abroad, right, because of the neocolonization that continues to happen, as opposed to thinking about the health and well-being of our communities. And sadly, to this day, the communities that are hit hardest by over-policing are Black communities or African-American communities. And I want to just go back. All the progress that African-American communities have done on behalf of all communities of color have benefited Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. And we need to start to build these kinds of coalitions. We need to build alliances and support each other and elevate each other. And I think the pitting of putting the police in that begins to prevent us from creating that type of alliances. And that's why it's so alarming and so dangerous.
Right. Absolutely. I was telling the inclusion group before that you can see some of the comments on social media about, when there's an attack on an Asian, and these Asian people are like, oh, well, do you see they're Black? Or, when a Black activist is saying stop Asian hate, and you see some of the comments, they're like, well, what did the Asian community do for us? Right. So it's really, how do we build those bridges and stop that kind of narrative? Obviously, there are some, tensions that we need to address, but it is something that we have to be aware of in our own communities. You don't get to pick and choose your battles. Like, one day I'm only focusing on stopping Asian hate, and the next minute I'm turning a blind eye to what's happening in Minneapolis. But going to your thought about, mental health and well-being, we talked about this. How do you constantly fight the good fight? How do you stay angry about what happened over the weekend with Dante, with George Floyd, with these attacks happening to Asian elders, and not give into fatigue?
Well, sometimes, Linda, as you know, I have to give into fatigue. I think it's okay. I think it's okay for all of us to say we're exhausted. And I think folks who don't say that, I'm like, wow, like, what are you on, right? Because it is so tiring. And I think you give yourself permission to, reach out to hopefully people you have support from, to say, I am so tired. I am just so exhausted. I'm so fatigued. I think the question is, how do we pick ourselves back up, right? And sometimes it's hard. Even for myself. But I think I go back to people like you, Linda, and to folks who are here today who really want to make a difference. That actually keeps me going, is building coalitions and building relationships, and really thinking about how do we have restorative work on ourselves by, one, is kind of insisting on institutional changes. A lot of times when we have incidents of hate, people take things personally, especially when we talk about, white supremacy. A lot of, in the past, white people have had white guilt, or they feel like, you hate me because I'm white. It's not about individual. We're attacking the system of oppression. We're attacking system of racism. We're attacking the institution. And I think when people begin to look at it from a high level, that this system is broken, and they begin to see that this anti-oppression work, anti-racist work, anti-fascist work, because Antifa has gotten bad names. Some Antifa are pretty radical, but being anti-fascist is a good thing. I also don't understand that narrative where somehow being anti-fascist is a bad thing, right? Like, I think that's a good thing. And I'm actually a faculty, I'm in a part of a group for faculty who are anti-fascist, and I don't know about you, for if you study the Holocaust, or if you look at the hardship that Jewish Americans and the rise of anti-Semitism even today stems from fascists, right? We don't want Nazis here. We don't want that type of demeanor, but somehow people are drawn to that autocratic, I don't know what's the word. I just had a brain fart, but you know what I mean, like the ones who try to be authoritative and dictatorial is the word I was looking for. But I think it's really so important for us to kind of think about, okay, how do we do restorative work? How do we build the connections that we are actually fighting the same fight? And I find like-minded people that give me hope. So folks like Helen Zia, she and I text regularly, like whenever I need to pick me up, I'll just message her, or people like Maya Sotero, who gave an awesome talk yesterday for the Wegland series. I will message people who I feel that sometimes when I'm not doing well, I need a lift up. And if you can have someone like that, that is awesome. If you can have it within your agency, having a safe space where you know that you could be vulnerable without having questions of, really, is it that bad? Like, do you ever experience that? Those things will shut people down, right? And I read Helen a little while ago in one of your groups saying that even her child was asking, why do people hate us? I think when we express fatigue and frustration to our colleagues or to our friends, and they don't listen, we don't want to share. I mean, we kind of know who are we safe to talk to that will actually listen to us, that will actually care, and actually will just listen, not to give me a solution, not to tell me what to do, but just to listen. I think that is a first step in terms of healing.
Right.
I think also in terms of, how do you do more restorative and how do you keep fighting, is that I'm committed. It's something that's part of my DNA now. It's something that I can't stop. It's not just Black lives. It's not just Asian, anti-Asian hate. It's also when we see attack on Standing Rock with Indigenous community, with the pipeline. It's also with DACA children or undocumented people. It's also with disabled bodies. And it's also with environmental racism, where climate change has disproportionately impacted poor communities. It's also about queer communities and trans communities. To me, they're all related.
Right.
I don't pick and choose. I feel that if you have to, sometimes you do have to prioritize for your own mental health, right? And you also want to maximize your strength, because not all of us can do everything. But it's not just about giving money. Money's great, right? So if you can give to communities and if you can give to people who are doing, that's awesome. But that's a tin cup approach. It's aware, like in Salvation Army, the one who rings the bell with the tin, or during Thanksgiving, people volunteer at the food bank and you give and you feel good about yourself because you gave. You should feel good because you gave, but it should be all the time. It shouldn't just be about giving money or signing a petition. It's about going out there and doing something. One of the things that you and I've talked about is doing a bystander training. The Asian American Advancing Justice right now has been organizing and coordinating bystander training. And it's really for folks that if you see something happening, I would never want anyone to put themselves at risk. So please don't get hurt, right? But doesn't mean you close the door like that one person did in New York. Call. For me, my instinct will probably to jump in. I mean, that's just kind of my personality, and I'll probably end up getting really badly beaten or hurt. But I think I wouldn't encourage everyone to do that. You have to find what action means to you. And even if you are giving, or if you're petitioning, or if you're sharing in social media once, twice, 3 times, really it's just a 10-cup approach. If you're truly committed to it, then you want to continue to educate yourself first and foremost, and then share your information, have conversations. I love it when my non-Asian American friends and allies talk to other people in their communities, because we're tired. It's so exhausting, and we don't speak for all Asian Americans. I'm Japanese, Korean, we're all different ethnic groups with different lives and different experiences. We can't speak for all Asian Americans, but we can speak to the idea that we're all seen as the same in this country, despite the plenitude of our communities. And I think it's so important for all of you, if you're really truly committed in anti-racist work and supporting our communities of color and Indigenous communities, is to step up, and find out what that means for you. Like, I'm pretty out there, but not everyone can be, right? And that's okay. I don't think people should feel bad that I can't do what you do, right? And you shouldn't. You should do what your strength is. You should do what it brings me joy, believe it or not. I'm exhausted, but it also brings me joy. Like coming and talking to all of you today brings me joy. It makes me feel really good that an agency like yours want to hear about it and want to learn and have, over 150 people here participating. That gives me joy and it gives me hope. And I think that's what I would recommend that folks try to do in terms of keep fighting. Those are some of the strategies that have worked for me.
Right. And going back to having a safe space, I mean, I do want to give a plug to Inclusion Council. We are a safe space. And I also want to talk about how feeling guilty is not productive. And Kirk and Tim Murphy, I want to give you guys kudos, because earlier this year we were planning, just doing our plan for the Inclusion Council. And, we felt a little like we didn't accomplish everything that we wanted to. And I think they were great in helping us hone in and just pick those, 2 to 3 things that you can accomplish. But even those little things, like even showing up today, learning, reading a book, is all things that will help us to progress in the long run. So I think, I think those are all helpful tips. We can't do everything, but we can do some things within our wheelhouse, within our comfort zone.
And we'll have good days and bad days, right? There are days that you have way more energy to do stuff, and there are days that you just want to crawl into bed and just Netflix all day long,
I know.
That's okay. That's
right.
I think you just have to give your permission to not do anything. I think our country, during COVID and pandemic, people have actually been working longer hours. This virtual climate has made it much more challenging. And I think we have to give each other grace. I think we have to show compassion and kindness. Some of the upper heads, if you have leaders in this group, really giving people opportunities to not be present sometime is important, especially for those who are caring for young children. They're working 3 jobs right now, right? So if you think about parents, they have their kids going to school virtually, plus they're doing all this stuff. They're juggling way more than ever before. And if some of you are caretakers of older people, right, of parents or grandmas or siblings or whatever, I think we just have to be so much more gracious right now and show compassion. And that's what we need. We need more kindness. It sounds so kumbaya-ish, but it's true. We just need people to be more kind and and show more empathy, and putting yourself in the position of the other and allowing. I think for me, what I've worked on a lot, and I think for a lot of leaders, I hope you're doing this as well, is showing more vulnerability, is knowing that sometimes we don't have all the answers, and that's okay, but is being vulnerable and not being afraid to show that we don't know everything, but we want to learn. And I learned so much from my students. So it's awesome to see so many Broncos here. I think there's several Broncos here, but I always learn from my students. And I think my students always give me a jolt of adrenaline, because I just see the future is going to be okay when I work with my students.
Right. Well, on that note, we are drawing near to the end, and do want to offer a space to ask questions. You can enter in the chat. But I also wanted to announce, not to just take the tin cup approach, but we are doing generously a donation match. So INNOCEAN is going to match up to $2,500 in donations, similar to what we did with the LDF last year. We will, if you donate to Stop Asian Hate, I'll send you all the information on email after this meeting. Send your receipt to HR. Again, the address I'll put in the email, and we'll give 3 weeks for us to start donating. And I think with talks like these, and providing people with the resources, organizations with the resources, we can sort of have the education to change a generation, hopefully sooner rather than later. Do we have any comments? Well, I think everybody, I do hope that we did learn from this conversation. Obviously, there's so much to this issue. It's hard to cover in an hour. But, I think these talks help us, to lean into what's happening. I know admit sometimes I kind of put my, I had this tendency where I just want to turn a blind eye because it's just too much. It's too much. But, I think with all of these events, we simply can't. On that note, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Inclusion Council, for having these. I'm patting myself in the back right now.
As you should, as you should.
Did I forget anything, Kurt? I don't know if I forgot any other announcements.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you so much, Dr. Danico. This has been incredible. Appreciate your time and insights and inspiration. And would love to, via Linda, stay connected to you. I'd love to hear more about the bystander training that you and your peers are working on. I think that is a phenomenal just avenue to help continue to, bridge these horrible gaps that we need to bridge. So again, thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful. And thank you, Linda, so much for your work on this and for coordinating it and getting us introduced to Dr. Danico.